On September 3, 1939, the world finally realized there was no turning back. Great Britain and France had just declared war on the Third Reich, yet millions of people across the European continent and beyond still clung to the hope that this war would spare the defenseless. They believed in international conventions, the rules of naval combat, and basic human decency. They were wrong. The gates of a true maritime hell open not in the offices of admirals, but in the cold, stormy waters of the Atlantic, northwest of the coast of Ireland. That very day, long before the official declaration of war, the British passenger liner Athenia was making her way through the open ocean. On board, an atmosphere of anxiety mixed with relief prevailed. The ship was en route from Glasgow to Montreal, Canada, calling at Liverpool and Belfast along the way. There were over 1,400 people on board, mostly civilians, women, children, and hundreds of American and Canadian tourists desperately trying to flee a Europe that was on the verge of igniting. People on deck drank tea, discussed rumors from the newspapers, and gazed at the horizon, believing that every mile separating them from European shores brought them closer to safety. They considered their liner untouchable. After all, the vessel was strictly civilian, completely unarmed, and sailing without a military escort. But safety in the ocean of September 39 was nothing more than an illusion. Just a few miles away from the liner, hidden beneath the dense cover of dark, cold ocean water, lurked a true predator. The German submarine U-30. At her helm stood Lieutenant Commander Fritz Julius Lemp, a young, ambitious, and zealous officer of the Kriegsmarine. For several days, his submarine had been patrolling its grid in absolute radio silence, waiting for orders from Berlin. And then, the radio operator transmitted the long-awaited message. The war had begun. Through the periscope, Lemp spotted the large silhouette of a ship on the horizon. The vessel was zigzagging without any lights, attempting to mask itself in the rapidly descending twilight of the Atlantic. For the young captain who craved glory and his first victory, this maneuver became a fatal argument. Lemp assumed that before him lay not a civilian liner, but a British auxiliary cruiser, or an armed military transport carrying soldiers or weapons. A combat alarm echoed through the decks of the U-30. The crew acted precisely and swiftly, like a well-oiled machine. Creeping at depth, the submarine assumed the ideal position for an attack. The torpedo tubes were primed. The commander held his breath, staring into the crosshairs of the periscope. The distance closed with every passing second. The liner Athenia suspected nothing. In the main dining room, dinner was just being served. Children played in the cabins, and Captain James Cook checked the course. Only minutes remained before sunset. At 1940, Fritz Julius Lemp gave the fateful order. Tube. Fire. Compressed air hissed as it launched the torpedo from the tube. Steel Death propelled through the water at a speed of over 40 knots, leaving behind a barely visible white trail of bubbles. On board the Athenia, no one had time to comprehend what was happening. The lookout spotted no threat in the evening twilight of the ocean. At 1945, the explosion struck. A powerful blow shuddered the hull of the liner. The torpedo hit directly in the stern, near the fifth hold and the engine room. A pillar of water, flame, and debris erupted higher than the masts. The lights on the ship instantly went out, plunging the interior decks into complete, impenetrable darkness. The passenger liner, which just a second ago had been a symbol of comfort, trembled and began to list slowly to the port side, falling silent in the midst of the vast ocean. The explosion transformed the peaceful dinner aboard the Athenia into a bloody chaos. Water rushed into the mangled hull, flooding the lower decks where hundreds of passengers, mostly women with children who were already putting their little ones to sleep, were located at that very moment. In the pitch black, amid the sounds of grinding metal and screams for help, people blindly tried to fight their way to the exits. Captain Cook and his officers acted instantaneously. Emergency power was cut in on the bridge, and radio operators began continuously broadcasting a distress signal into the ether. SSSOSO, we have been torpedoed. This SSS signal was a new international code, meaning attacked by a submarine. The crew began guiding passengers to the upper deck for evacuation. However, panic spread like wildfire. Due to the ship's heavy list, some lifeboats became jammed. People fell into the freezing water, clung to the railings, and jostled near the sides. Some leapt directly into the ocean, hoping to find salvation on floating debris. Following the thunderous impact, the Athenia was instantly gripped by a claustrophobic terror. With the electrical grid shattered, the lower decks became pitch-black traps, rapidly filling with rushing, freezing Atlantic water. Hundreds of passengers who only moments prior were finishing their dinner or putting their children to bed found themselves scrambling blindly through narrow, tilting corridors. The air was thick with the scream of tearing iron, frantic shouts, and the desperate cries of families separated in the dark. On the bridge, Captain James Cook and his officers moved into action with disciplined urgency. Forcing the emergency batteries to life, the wireless operators began hammering out a desperate distress call across the global airwaves. SSSOSO, we have been torpedoed. The prefix SSS was a chillingly critical wartime protocol, specifically broadcasting to any ship in range that a hostile submarine was actively hunting in the area. On the listing upper deck, the crew struggled against the ship's worsening tilt to launch the wooden lifeboats. Panic spread like wildfire as several boats jammed on their davits, rendering them useless. Terrified passengers slipped and tumbled into the churning sea, clutching desperately to guide ropes and railings as others jumped directly into the freezing waves, hoping to pull themselves onto floating wreckage. A few miles away, the dark silhouette of the German submarine U-30 broke the surface of the water. Clambering onto the conning tower, Lieutenant Commander Fritz Julius Lemp raised his binoculars to observe his prize. As the smoke from the explosion drifted away into the moonlight, the young captain's triumph instantly dissolved into cold horror. Through his lenses, there was no sign of a heavily armed troop transport or an auxiliary cruiser. Instead, he clearly saw the unmistakably massive silhouette of a civilian passenger liner. He watched through the moonlight as lifeboats crowded with women in evening dresses and screaming children pulled away from the dying vessel. The distant sound of their panic drifted over the waves directly to his ears. A cold sweat broke out across Lemp's face. He realized in an instant that he had just committed a catastrophic error. He had directly violated strict orders from Adolf Hitler himself, which explicitly forbade attacks on passenger liners to prevent drawing the neutral United States into the conflict. Furthermore, he had violated the long-standing international laws of maritime warfare. Terrified of a military court-martial, Lemp made a cynical, cowardly choice. Rather than rendering aid to the drowning civilians, he ordered the U-30 to submerge immediately and flee. The submarine slipped back into the oceanic depths, abandoning hundreds of souls to fend for themselves in the middle of the Atlantic. To ensure the crime remained hidden, Lemp forced his crew to take a strict oath of absolute silence and personally ripped the page detailing the attack out of the submarine's official logbook. Left alone in the night, the survivors faced a grueling, hours-long battle for survival against the sea. The Athenia proved remarkably resilient, remaining afloat for over 14 hours, which allowed the crew to evacuate the vast majority of those on board. Yet tragedy still struck in the darkness. One fully loaded lifeboat, packed mostly with women, drifted directly into the path of the Norwegian cargo ship Knut Nelson, which had been the first to answer the distress call. In the blinding dark, the merchant ship's massive turning propeller struck the wooden lifeboat, chewing it to splinters and instantly dragging dozens of lives into the depths. Another boat capsized in the heavy wake of the arriving British destroyer HMS Escort, plunging survivors back into the icy grasp of the ocean. By the time the final tallies were made, 112 innocent people had perished in the night. Among the dead were 28 American citizens. The very first civilian blood of the war had been spilled, and it stained the dark waters of the Atlantic. The dawn of September 4th found the Atlantic littered with scattered debris, empty lifeboats, and bobbing life jackets. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the battered passenger liner Athenia finally vanished beneath the waves, taking the physical secrets of her demise down to the ocean floor forever. The majority of the passengers were saved thanks to the swift reaction of British destroyers and nearby civilian vessels, but the political explosion of this attack proved far more powerful than the torpedo itself. Upon learning of the tragedy, panic gripped Berlin. Adolf Hitler and the commander of the submarine fleet, Karl Dönitz, understood perfectly that the death of American citizens on a civilian ship could instantly throw the United States into the arms of Great Britain, repeating the devastating script of the First World War and the sinking of the Lusitania. The German propaganda machine, led by Joseph Goebbels, immediately turned its factory of lies up to full capacity. They categorically denied any involvement by German submarines. Instead, German newspapers ran screaming headlines accusing the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, of ordering the destruction of the British liner himself to frame Germany and drag America into the conflict. The lie was so brazen that the Kriegsmarine officially concealed the truth, even from its own diplomats. Yet, despite Berlin's desperate efforts to douse the international scandal, and despite Hitler's temporary strict orders not to attack passenger ships, the veil had been lifted. The torpedo strike on the Athenia became an ominous prophecy. It revealed to the entire world exactly what this war at sea would look like. No rules, no mercy, and no division between combatants and civilians. The commander of the German submarine fleet, Karl Dönitz, had long nurtured a strategy designed to strangle Great Britain, an island empire completely dependent on food and raw material supplies shipped across the ocean. His strategy was called simply unrestricted submarine warfare. This meant that any vessel, no matter what flag it flew, no matter what cargo it carried, became a legitimate target for German U-boats the moment it entered the waters surrounding the British Isles. Dönitz began organizing his famous wolf packs, groups of submarines that, like packs of hungry predators, would patrol the ocean lanes, stalk Allied convoys, and sink them in the dead of night. The shot from an outdated battleship in Gdansk opened the gates of hell on land, and the torpedo fired by the submarine U-30 at the defenseless Athenia transformed the entire global ocean into a battlefield. Ahead lay 6 years of a fierce, bloody, and exhausting Battle of the Atlantic. Years when thousands of ships would plunge to the bottom and tens of thousands of sailors would burn in fuel fires or freeze to death in polar waters. Captain Fritz Julius Lemp would never stand trial for his first crime. He would go down with his next submarine in May of 1941. But it was his first fatal salvo on September 3rd, 1939, that forever erased the illusion of safety from the face of the earth. The Atlantic became a territory of fear, where beneath every wave a steel predator could be hiding, ready to rip peaceful life to shreds.